I also want to let you guys know that after the second worship service today, the folks who went to that General Assembly that Chris and Mara described are going to gather for a brown bag lunch to talk about what they experienced and think about the future of our immigration justice work here at First Unitarian, and everybody is welcome to join in that conversation. That's going to be about 12:30 in the social hall. The purpose of this year's General Assembly was not only to provide a powerful experience of witness and action, but also to equip us UUs to return home to our churches with new information and skills for the larger work of social justice, for immigration and beyond. So there were tons of workshops. Many of them did have an immigration focus, but others were about the theologies of love that underpin this work. Some were about spiritual practices that can help keep us from getting too overwhelmed or weary to live out our faith in the world. And others were informational. There was one lecture listed under the category of multiculturalism that caught my eye. It was by Michelle Alexander. She's a civil rights lawyer who taught at Stanford, and she's the author of a book about mass incarceration. Now, this is an issue that is also close to my heart. In 2004, while I was working on my bachelor's degree, I did a year-long internship in a men's maximum security prison in Oregon, where I shadowed a Buddhist chaplain. A men's maximum security prison, that was something. My husband, Carlos, had been working at the prison. Sometimes he would come home and tell me stories about inmates who sounded like people I could have known growing up. In fact, I have known people who've gone to jail or prison, several people. So that either means that I am one bad influence, or a lot of people are getting locked up. A lot of people are getting locked up. In fact, I'll bet many of you have known some of them too. Some of you, I'm sure, have family members who have been or are incarcerated, and a few of you have probably served time yourselves. The reason I'm so sure about this is that the US prison population has exploded. In less than 30 years, it went from about 300,000 people to more than 2 million people incarcerated. This is due mostly to the war on drugs, which was launched by our government in 1982. Now, I want to tell you a few things about the war on drugs. First, an interesting fact is that when it was launched, drug use was already on the decline. Remember the 1960s and 70s? If you were there and you don't remember it, it might be because of all the drugs. The 80s weren't like that. The 80s were different. Drug use was already on the decline. Next, low-level drug convictions make up the vast majority of those arrested in the war on drugs. These aren't drug lords, but people arrested either for being in possession of drugs for recreational use or being caught stealing to support a drug addiction. Third, studies have shown that white people use drugs as much as any other racial group. Again, if you were there for the 60s and 70s and you remember it, that won't surprise you. In fact, the majority of illegal drug users and dealers across the nation are white. But 3/4 of people imprisoned for drug crimes are Black or Latino. Many people assume there must be more drug crime in minority communities, but in fact, that just isn't the case. What is true is that Black or Hispanic people are much more likely than whites to be stopped and searched by police. Although from the outset the war on drugs could have been waged on college and high school campuses, it has mostly taken place in low-income neighborhoods, especially if they're populated by racial minorities. You know, I grew up in a poor neighborhood, and I clearly remember standing on the corner when I was about 8 years old and watching as a drug bust went down, and one of my neighbors fled past me down the street trying to get away from police. In fact, that happened several times when I was a kid. Later, I got a scholarship and went to Harvard. There were a lot of drugs there too, but never a drug bust. I was shocked at the bravado of wealthy white people when it came to drug use. And it turns out there's a reason they feel relatively safe. It's hard to put a finger on the racism in the drug war. Few police officers, prosecutors, judges, or jurors would express a blatant kind of racism. I doubt most of them even think that they are blatantly racist, yet the data paints a very clear picture. If you are black or brown, and especially if you also live in a poor community, you are far more likely to be arrested for a drug crime than someone who's white. Now, once somebody's arrested, it usually goes something like this. You're held in jail while a court-appointed attorney is found for you if you can't afford an attorney of your own. The public attorney, or public defender, may have as many as 1,000 cases at a given time, so there's little chance they'll be able to do any research into your case. Meanwhile, the days are ticking by. If you have kids, they are either with a relative or in foster care during this time. You're anxious to get back to them. Eventually, the prosecutor offers you a plea bargain. Plead guilty to a seemingly minor drug felony, and you'll only get probation. Argue against it, and you'll go before a jury where you may face a mandatory sentence if they convict you of something worse. It's common practice for prosecutors to threaten to charge people with more serious crimes that they might not really be able to prove in court. The person being threatened doesn't know whether they'll be able to prove their own innocence or not, and so even if you're innocent, after enough time waiting in jail, you might decide to go ahead and take the deal to get yourself relieved, to get home to your kids, to get back to your life. But once you do that, you're branded as a drug felon. You may have lost your job due to your absence from work, and you have lost your eligibility for food stamps, federal financial aid for college, and your right to vote. It's now legal for employers to discriminate against you. If you're in public housing, you may be evicted from it. And once you're homeless, your kids may be returned to foster care. After that, if you can't arrange the bus fare to get to the meeting with your probation officer, or if holding a job is a requirement of your probation, as it often is, you may be thrown back in jail, this time for longer. Or if under these circumstances you become desperate to feed and house your family, and say you write a couple of bad checks, you could suddenly find yourself convicted of 3 felonies, the original drug felony and 1 for each bad check. If you live in a 3-strike state, that might mean you go to prison for the rest of your life. All because you either possessed a small amount of drugs, or someone thought you did, and you went along with it to get it behind you. You can see what a slippery slope this can be for people. If you think I'm making it up, just look at the mismatch between the steady growth in our prisons and our national crime rate, which goes up and down with little or no relation to the rate of incarceration. Once you're branded with a drug crime, you become part of an underclass that is easily and legally discriminated against, and that road can easily lead you back to jail. The result of the war on drugs and its slippery slopes is that the U.S. locks up a higher percentage of its population than any other country in the world, more than Cuba, China, Russia, Iran, Afghanistan, or any other country. And it locks up more of its racial minorities than any other country. More black people are in prison now than were enslaved in 1850, a decade before emancipation. We hear in the media from time to time a critique, a stereotype of black men as being absent from their families. In 2008, Barack Obama even called upon them to stop being AWOL, but Michelle Alexander points out, neither he nor anyone else in the mainstream media the next day addressed the fact that 1 million black men are in prison or jail, involuntarily separated from their families, mostly because they were targets in the war on drugs, a federal program with obvious racial bias in the way it is applied. In total, 7.3 million people of all races and ethnicities are under correctional supervision in the U.S., meaning if they're not locked up, they're on parole or probation. 7.3 million. What is the population of the US? Does anybody know? I have about 300 million. So 7 million out of our 300 million people are under so-called correctional control. That's a little over 2%, or 1 out of every 50 people. So statistically, whatever race or ethnicity you identify with, a great many of us must be impacted by this, and yet we never talk about it. Prisons are either remotely located or they're behind tall walls. We can't really see them. And people whose family members are imprisoned or on probation or parole don't talk about it. It's too stigmatizing. Mass incarceration is right under our noses, but we can't see it. People disappear. Even from the consciousness of their own communities, prisoners become invisible. That's why I decided to do the internship. I wanted to see them. I'll never forget the first day I went down to the prison. On the way over, my stomach was just in knots. I repeated out loud the words of Unitarian Universalism's first principle, the inherent worth and dignity of every person. How could I claim to believe in that if I let some people stay invisible to me? And so I parked and I passed through security with nothing but a notepad and a pen in my hand. I crossed the threshold through the double doors, the iron gates, and I heard them clang and lock behind me as I stepped into a huge cement room. It had a distinct institutional smell, like metal and pavement, mixed with a lot of sweaty men crowded together. Now, I had no illusions about who I was meeting in there. This was a maximum security facility. They are not all drug felons. I'm not a stranger to violent crimes and their consequences, especially in the lives of women, but I was shocked by the systematic, intentional dehumanization that is carried out behind bars. I remember seeing a romantic story at some point about a poor man who gets himself arrested so he can get medical care and free food. No one who knew the condition of the prison I saw would ever take that chance. Here's the reality. Prisons are violent, soul-crushing places. Each year, more than 70,000 people are raped inside our prisons. Every day, 50,000 people wake up in solitary confinement. That's like being locked in a walk-in closet with only 1 hour a day to get out for shower and exercise. And then there were the families. I saw them each week in the waiting area outside security, little kids and mothers and grandmothers waiting to see the men inside. When someone's incarcerated, they're often sent far away from their home community, so many of these families had traveled long distances to get there during visitor hours. What happens after they arrive is unpredictable. There are often lockdowns at prisons. When no one's allowed in or out, that means visitation is canceled, maybe without warning. And then there were a lot of ways you could fail to pass security. Blue clothing was a no-no. Skirts were not allowed. Underwire bras were not allowed. But women were not allowed to enter the prison without a bra either. The bathroom garbage can was full of bra wires women had cut out and thrown away so that they could go in. The expense for these families was tremendous, too. The only way inmates can make a phone call is to call collect, and phone companies charge special rates for these, many times the rate of a regular collect call. There were court costs and travel and lodging costs if the prison was far from home. Often the man who was locked up had been a family breadwinner, and now many of the families were dependent on public assistance. Perhaps the saddest thing is that our correctional system doesn't do much correcting at all. People often do not receive drug or alcohol treatment, even if their arrest was addiction-related. The experience is traumatizing, financially devastating, and once you've been in prison, it's very, very hard to get your life back on track, especially if you have a drug felony on your record. And most drug charges are felonies. I was curious about to what extent this is an issue here in Albuquerque, and so I called upon one of our public defenders this week. He told me that in Albuquerque, except for very small amounts of marijuana, every case of drug possession, no matter how small, is charged as a felony. And he said, the overwhelming majority of people who are charged are Black, Hispanic, or Native American. Furthermore, everyone who is jailed, even if it's for a misdemeanor and they're quickly released, has their name and photo posted on a searchable database on the internet. Now, once released, a person who's been branded a drug felon faces some incredible challenges. This is what many call the invisible punishment, the one that's served after the time served. If you're branded a drug felon, it's legal for employers to discriminate you, even though having a job might be a condition of your parole. If you get a job and you owe back child support from your time behind bars, or if you live in a state where prisoners are required to pay back some of the cost of their incarceration, up to 100% of your wages can be garnished. How are you supposed to live? By the way, because of your felony, you can't qualify for food stamps or federal financial aid for school either. You will be, in effect, locked out of the legal economy. How are people supposed to feed themselves and stay out of trouble under these conditions? Another common condition of parole is that you may not associate with any other felons. In some neighborhoods, just walking to the grocery store could get you into trouble on that count. What are people supposed to do? What does this system seem designed to do? It seems designed to send people back to prison. And that's what it does. We have a recidivism rate of over 60%, but it's not as clear-cut as people wanting or not wanting to obey the law. The majority of them are barred from the legal economy and the kind of assistance that would help them get a leg up, and they face impossible odds. The effect of all this is that we're locking poor and vulnerable people into a 21st century caste system. And most of them are black or brown. Here's where Michelle Alexander, that Stanford professor and writer, makes a shocking observation. It is legal to discriminate against people who have been branded as criminals. In almost all of the ways it was once legal to discriminate against blacks during Jim Crow. The title of her book about mass incarceration is The New Jim Crow. Think about it: voting, housing, employment, public benefits, exclusion from juries. Whatever our intentions, the effect is very much like a caste system, and once you're caught up in it, you may be in it for life. Around this, we've developed a prison industrial complex. I haven't even begun to talk about that, but you get the sense of the problem if you realize that if we were to return to the incarceration rates we had before the war on drugs was launched, 1 million people would lose their jobs. Our economy has become increasingly interwoven with incarcerating people. So if we want to make a change, it's going to take more than just policy changes. It's going to take a movement, a human rights movement. It's got to start with us telling ourselves the truth about what it is our country is doing, that we now have a new kind of caste system, and that it's not just a war on drugs. We need study groups and forums to make the invisible visible. And Michelle Alexander suggests we need to build an underground railroad for people who are trying to make a break for freedom. Not people who are trying to break out of jail, but people who've been released and who will be condemned to return unless they can find a job, housing, and education. Underneath this whole system is this core belief that some people can be thrown away. But we don't believe that here. We believe in something better: inherent worth and dignity, and our capacity to affirm it in the sweltering heat of Arizona, in the state of New Mexico, and all across the country, and through the influence of our own lives. So may it be. I want to invite you to rise and join hands